19 years ago, I left the hospital with empty arms and a silence that hollowed out the rest of my life. I stopped going near playgrounds. I stopped listening to lullabies. I stopped hoping. But then, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, a boy walked into my diner. He was taller, older, worn thin from whatever life he'd been living, and on his left cheek, just beneath the bone, was the same crescent-shaped birthmark I used to kiss goodnight. The one the doctors said I'd never see again. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever touched your life. Every click helps bring another forgotten truth back into the light. I'm Amanda Collins. I'm 42 and I own a small diner just outside Portland, Maine. Nothing fancy, 4 booths a counter with 5 stools coffee that burns if you forget it for more than a minute. I bought it 11 years ago after I stopped running. That's what it felt like anyway. The kind of running you do even while standing still. Back then, I told myself I needed something to tether me, something solid. The diner became that. A place where the doors opened at 6 sharp, the grill hissed to life, and the world made just enough sense to get through the day. The regulars helped too. Roy came in most mornings, always ordered the same oatmeal, always tipped in quarters. Dee brought her little Yorkie in a tote bag and left half-finished crossword puzzles at the counter like offerings. And Michael, he stopped in every Friday. We never talked about the night I lost my son unless I brought it up. I never did. My apartment's right above the diner. 2 rooms, 1 window that looks out over the bay. In the mornings, I'd watch the fog roll across the water like a secret keeping its breath. Some days that's all I'd hear. The hush of the tide, the clink of ceramic mugs, the faint hum of the old refrigerator. And on most of those mornings, I'd take out the photo. It's just a snapshot. Taken at the hospital, a nurse in pink scrubs had snapped it before she handed me my baby. His name was Noah. He had a full head of brown hair and the sleepiest hazel eyes. His skin was still red and soft from birth, and there, clear as moonlight, was the mark on his left cheek, shaped like a crescent, like he'd been kissed by something half-formed. I never framed the photo, never put it on a wall. I kept it folded, tucked inside my wallet. Sacred, somehow, because it was private, untouchable. It was the only thing in my life that hadn't faded. That's what I was doing that morning. Standing behind the counter, rubbing my thumb across the photo's creases, smoothing the same invisible wrinkle I'd worn into it after all these years. It was 6:47 a.m. The bell over the door jingled. I didn't look up right away. I figured it was Roy or Dee or someone looking for an early cup of coffee before the ferry went out. But when I finally glanced up, I didn't see a regular. I saw a teenage boy. He was soaked from the drizzle outside, water beating on the shoulders of his hoodie, jeans too long for his legs, backpack slung to one side, and a face that made everything in me go still. He didn't say anything at first, just glanced up at the menu like he was deciding on a muffin. But my eyes locked on that mark, same cheek, same crescent curve, just a little darker now. I froze. He ordered a black coffee. No sugar, sat in the corner booth by the window, the same one I used to sit in every Tuesday morning before work, before I gave up the library, before the search ended. I poured his coffee by habit, but my hands weren't steady. I walked it to his table. Our eyes met for a second. "Thanks," he said, soft, polite. Then he looked away. I went back behind the counter, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I watched the way he adjusted his backpack, the way his fingers bent just slightly at the pinky, the same way Noah's had when he was born. A harmless little quirk, the pediatrician said. Something genetic, maybe. He didn't notice me watching. He drank his coffee in silence. Paid in cash. No tip. Then he walked out, the bell above the door chiming behind him. I didn't ask his name. But as I cleared his table, I found something he left behind. A folded bus pass. Chicago Transit Authority. Student fare. Name, Ethan Wallace. And just like that, it wasn't over. Not even close. Michael showed up the next morning just before the sun crested the bay, the kind of light that softens everything it touches. I hadn't slept. I'd sat up all night with that bus pass in my hand, flipping it over and over, tracing the name with my thumb like it could tell me more if I just stared hard enough. When he walked in, I was already behind the counter, coffee half-poured, eyes gritty. He didn't ask how I was. He just took one look at me, then at the pass sitting by the register and said, "Talk to me." I slid it toward him. He picked it up slowly, read the name, turned it over. "Chicago." I nodded. He came in yesterday morning, ordered coffee, sat at the window. I could feel my voice thinning, trying not to break. He had it, Michael. The mark, same cheek. And his pinky, it bent just like Noah's. I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the years of being careful with me. "I know how it sounds," I said before he could say anything. "I'm not saying I'm sure. I'm saying it felt like something opened. Like it wasn't over." Michael set the pass down and looked at me carefully. "Do you want me to run the name?" "Yes," I said too fast. Then quieter. "Please." By afternoon, he had something. Ethan Wallace. 19, enrolled at a community college just outside Chicago. Lives with a woman named Diane Wallace. No father listed. No siblings. Adoption record sealed. That last part made my stomach twist. Michael explained that sealed usually meant a private arrangement not through the state. Something quiet. Something someone wanted to keep quiet. He paused, then asked gently, "You want to go to Chicago?" I didn't answer right away. The thought of it, the noise, the distance, the chance of being wrong settled heavy on my chest. But the alternative was silence. The kind that had lived with me for nearly 2 decades. "Yes," I said. "Let's go." I left a note for Dee asking her to keep the diner closed. First time in 11 years. The drive took most of the day. Neither of us said much. I stared out the window, watching the world pass in blurs. Gas stations, strip malls, rusted fences, and wondered if he'd grown up looking out windows like these. If he'd ever wondered where he came from. If someone had told him lies, or nothing at all. When we reached the address tied to the bus pass, the street was quiet. Rows of brick houses, weathered siding, a lawn left half-mowed. The porch light was off. Diane Wallace answered the door wearing a dish towel over one shoulder and suspicion across her face. She looked to be in her late 40s, sharp eyes, thin mouth. "Can I help you?" she asked. Michael stepped forward. "We're looking for Ethan Wallace." Her face changed just a flicker, but I saw it. "He's not home," she said quickly. "And you are?" I opened my mouth, tried to steady my voice. "Amanda Collins. I think your son might be." She didn't let me finish. Her face drained of color. Then she shut the door hard. No screaming, no questions, just a door slamming shut like a lock clicking into place. I stood there, hand still lifted, heart beating too loud. Michael reached for the knob again, but I shook my head. "Wait," I said. "She knows something." He didn't argue. He just looked at the door and nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She does." We came back the next morning. Michael knocked again, this time holding up his badge. He explained he was out of state law enforcement, requested a welfare check. She didn't open the door, just spoke through it. "We're not interested. Leave us alone." Her voice wasn't angry. It was scared. Michael pressed again, but she didn't budge. So we waited, parked across the street, sat in silence. I watched the windows like they might blink. Hours passed. Then, just after noon, Ethan came home. He looked the same as I remembered from the diner hood, a backpack slung head down. He didn't see us. Walked straight up the driveway, unlocked the front door, went inside. My chest tightened. I turned to Michael. "We have to talk to him." "We can't just knock again," he said. "She could call the police." "But he's my—" I stopped. The word wouldn't finish. "We don't know that yet," he said. I leaned back against the seat, felt the exhaustion settle into my shoulders. "I do," I whispered. That night we checked into a motel that smelled like old smoke and damp carpet. I didn't unpack. I just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Michael made calls to a lawyer he knew to 2 adoption agencies to the hospital back in Maine. Everywhere he turned, the answer was the same. Records sealed. No comment. That information is protected. Everything was behind locked doors. That's when I asked it out loud for the first time. What if she didn't adopt him? What if she bought him? Michael didn't answer right away. Then we find out who sold him. The next morning I made a decision. I went to the campus where Ethan was enrolled, blended into a group of students near the library, waited by a bulletin board covered in flyers, tutoring room rentals, missing keys. And then he was there, walking across the courtyard, headphones in, hood down. His eyes were half closed, lost in thought. I stepped into his path. "Ethan." He stopped, looked up. His eyes flicked with something recognition hesitation. "You're the lady from the diner," he said. I nodded. "Yes." A pause. "You followed me?" "No. I needed to see you." He stepped back slightly. Why, I didn't try to explain. I just pulled out my phone and showed him the photo. The hospital picture. Me holding Noah. His face, his eyes, that mark. He looked at it, blinked. Then he stepped back again. "What is this?" he asked. "That's you," I said. "From the day you were born. Your name was Noah." His hands curled into fists. "I don't know who you are," he said, voice tight. "But you need to leave me alone." He turned. I reached for his sleeve. "Please just let me explain." He yanked his arm free. "Don't touch me," he snapped. Then he walked away. That night I sat in the motel room shaking. He looked scared, I told Michael, but not confused, just scared. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. "We need more than a photo. We need proof." I nodded, but it felt like trying to hold water in my hands. "The hospital won't give us anything. Maybe someone who used to work there will?" I thought for a second. "What about that nurse? The one from my delivery?" He looked at me. "Linda Graves." I nodded. "You remember her?" "Yeah." "She quit not long after the incident. Moved out of state. I tried to contact her once. She never responded." "Try again," I said. "Please." 3 days later, Linda agreed to meet. She lived in a small retirement home in Indiana. Her hair had gone gray, but her eyes were still sharp behind thick glasses. She opened the door, took one look at me, and just stepped aside. No questions, no introductions. We sat in her small kitchen. The light from the window fell across a table covered in tea rings and folded napkins. She didn't speak for a while. Then finally she said, "I always hoped this day would come." My eyes burned, but I didn't look away. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a patient report. Male infant. Collins. Birthmark crescent-shaped left cheek. She tapped the paper. I made a copy before I left. I knew it would disappear. My voice felt stuck. "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because they came to my house," she said. "Someone from hospital administration. Said they'd sue me for breach of contract. Ruin me." Michael leaned forward. "Do you know what happened to the baby?" Linda hesitated. "There was a doctor, Elridge. Always quiet, always private. Took on patients no one else asked about." She paused. The night Noah disappeared, I saw him leaving out the back with something in his arms. Said it was laundry. She slid another photo across the table. Grainy, distant. A man in scrubs carrying something. Time stamped 2:03 a.m. I stared at it until my hands started to shake. Back in Chicago, we didn't go back to the motel. I needed air. I sat in a park and just let the cold settle in. Then I saw him again. Ethan, hoodie up, backpack slung, walking alone. I stood, followed quietly. He turned down a side street. Narrow, empty. Then he stopped. "I know you're following me," he said, not turning. I froze. He turned slowly. His eyes were wet. "You're not crazy," he said. I didn't breathe. I asked my mom about the photo. She screamed at me, said you were lying. I swallowed hard. I'm not. I know. He looked at the sidewalk, then back at me. "I need to know the truth." I nodded. "I think you've always known it." He blinked hard. "Tell me everything." I did. All of it. Every piece I had. When I finished, he rolled up his sleeve and showed me a scar. "Got this when I was 7. Diane told me it was a fall. But..." He shook his head. "She lied." He looked down. "I never felt like I fit. Always felt like something was missing. I tried to speak, but he kept going. I don't know who I am anymore." "You're still you," I said. He didn't step closer, but he didn't step back. That night, he and I both knew we'd crossed into something we couldn't walk away from. What came next would be harder, bigger, but the silence had cracked. And that sound, that shift in the dark, it meant the truth was still out there. And maybe, just maybe, it was starting to come home. Michael and I didn't speak much on the drive back. After Ethan walked away, something in the air between us changed, like the weight of what we were chasing had finally settled into the space around us, and we both knew it wasn't going to lift anytime soon. I spent the ride turning over everything he'd said. The way his voice had tightened. The way he didn't ask who I was, just told me to leave. He wasn't confused. He was scared. There was a difference. Michael checked in with the lab again, but they wouldn't budge on access to sealed records. Everything pointed back to private placement, tight legal red tape, and silence. I stared out the window of the motel that night and tried not to let the quiet pull me under. I kept thinking about his face, the way he'd looked at the photo, like it had knocked something loose before he shoved it back down, like he almost believed it too. The next morning, Michael paced while I sat with the hotel phone pressed to my ear. I had found a number listed for Linda Graves, the nurse from the hospital, the one who'd taken the photo of me holding Noah all those years ago. I hadn't seen her since. Michael had tried once back when the case was still considered active. She hadn't returned the call. But this time she picked up. Her voice was thin, older now, but steady. I told her who I was. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "I've been waiting for this for 19 years. 3 days later, we were sitting in her small apartment just outside Bloomington, Indiana. The place was quiet. No TV, no background music, just the hum of the radiator and the occasional rattle of wind through the window frame. She was in her 70s now, frail in the shoulders, but her eyes were still sharp, like she'd never stopped paying attention. She didn't ask me how I'd found her. She just opened the door and let us in. We sat at her kitchen table, one of those old laminate ones with the metal trim, and she made tea without asking. I didn't touch mine. She didn't either. After a few minutes of silence, she pushed a small envelope across the table toward me. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photocopy yellowed around the edges, faint print fading from age. It was a hospital intake note. Male infant. Collins. Crescent-shaped birthmark, left cheek. She looked at me. "I made a copy before I left," she said. I knew it wouldn't stay in the file. "The morning after your baby disappeared, I went looking. His chart was gone. The nurse logs were altered. Someone scrubbed it clean, but I had already made this." I held the paper between my fingers and felt the blood leave my face. I'd spent years wondering if I'd imagined it all. That mark that night, the fear. But this was proof. Michael leaned forward. "Why didn't you come forward?" She looked down at her hands. "The hospital threatened to sue me, said I'd violated confidentiality, said they'd ruin my license. I was young. I didn't have a lawyer. I left instead." Her voice didn't tremble, but she didn't look up. Then she said something that made everything go quiet again. "There was a doctor," she said. "Dr. Charles Elridge. He worked the overnight rotation sometimes, kept to himself, never stayed long in one hospital. Always said he preferred private cases. I knew that name. I remembered it from the whiteboard outside my room, the one the nurses updated with the name of whoever was on call. I never saw him during my stay, but I remember the handwriting." Linda looked at me, then back at Michael. "The night Noah disappeared, I saw him. Elridge. He was in the staff parking lot just after 2:00 a.m. He was carrying something, wrapped in a blanket. Said it was laundry, but it wasn't." She reached into a small drawer beside her chair and pulled out a second envelope. "I took this photo, through the staff window. It's blurry, but I think it's enough." She passed it to Michael. He turned it toward me. The timestamp in the corner read 2:03 a.m. A figure in scrubs mid-step carrying a bundled shape in his arms. The parking lot lights left a faint halo on the frame, but the face wasn't clear. Still, I felt something twist in my chest. I had no proof it was my son, but I knew. When we got back to Chicago, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the motel. I walked to a small park instead, sat on a bench just off the path and stared at nothing. My hands were still shaking. The wind was cold and I didn't have a jacket. I didn't care. Then I saw him. Ethan. He was walking alone, hood up, same backpack. I didn't think. I just got up and followed at a distance. He turned down a narrow side street, a quiet block lined with chain-link fences and low shrubs. Then he stopped. "I know you're following me," he said without turning. I froze. He turned slowly to face me. His eyes were red. "You're not crazy," he said, voice low. I asked my mom about the photo. She flipped out, screamed at me, said you were lying. I swallowed hard. "I'm not." He nodded once. "I know." He looked away, then back again. "I need to know the truth." I stepped closer, but not too close. "I think you've always known it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me everything." We sat on a bench just off the sidewalk. I told him about the night he was born, about the missing files, the mark, the bent pinky, the photo, the nurse, Linda, the doctor, the envelope. I didn't spare him the details. I didn't try to soften it. He just listened, never interrupted. When I finished, he rolled up the sleeve of his sweatshirt. There was a long scar down his forearm. "I got this when I was 7, he said. I asked Diane how it happened. She said I fell down the stairs. But I don't remember falling. I just remember waking up in a hospital room." He stared at the scar. She lied. He looked at me. I've always felt like something was off, like I didn't belong. His voice broke slightly, like a radio that's just barely off the station. I nodded but didn't say anything. He looked down at his hands. "I don't know who I am anymore." I looked at him, this boy who wasn't a boy anymore, and said the only thing I could. "You're still you." He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away. That night he went home. I didn't hear from him. Not right away. I sat in the motel room with the envelope from Linda on the table in front of me, the photocopy laid out like it might whisper something if I stared long enough. Michael was on the phone in the other room making calls to anyone who might still have a connection to Elridge. Nothing yet, just silence and closed doors. But something had shifted. Ethan had listened, and he hadn't called me a liar. That was more than I had for 19 years. I didn't know what came next, but I knew the door wasn't shut, and this time I wasn't alone. I didn't expect to hear from him again so soon. It was only 3 nights later, just after 9, when my phone rang in the motel room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, going through the envelope from Linda again, not really reading, just touching the paper. The caller ID showed a Chicago area code. I picked up before the second ring. His voice was quieter than I remembered. Hollow, almost. He said, "She told me." I didn't speak. I just waited. Then he said, "She admitted it. She said she didn't steal me. She bought me." I felt everything around me still. He went on. Said her doctor gave me to her, no paperwork. No agency, just a name. He didn't say the name, but he didn't have to. I heard it in his breath. Elridge. When he hung up, I didn't move for a long time. I just stared at the motel wallpaper, little blue leaves in a pattern I'd never really seen before, and let the quiet stretch out around me. Michael came in a few minutes later, shaking rain off his jacket. He stopped when he saw my face. I told him what Ethan said. Michael sat down across from me, nodded once, then picked up the file. We stayed up until after midnight, going through every name we'd found connected to the hospital in 2006. Doctors, nurses, admins, janitors. Most were retired or had moved. Nothing solid. Then Michael sat back and rubbed his eyes. There was someone else, he said. Not hospital staff. Maintenance. A guy who kept to himself. Quiet, but he was always around late nights. I think his name was Russell Kane. I looked at him. Do you know where he is? He didn't, but he pulled out his laptop and started tracing. We found him 2 days later living in a trailer outside Flint, Michigan. Michael knocked on the door while I waited in the car. I watched through the windshield as the door opened and an older man stepped out. He was wiry, hunched slightly at the shoulders, and kept glancing over Michael's shoulder toward the road. After a minute, Michael motioned for me to come in. I hesitated, then got out and followed him up the steps. The inside of the trailer smelled like paint thinner and old coffee. Russell didn't say anything at first, just nodded once and sat down at a small table with one wobbly leg. His hands were shaking. Michael showed him his badge, explained who I was. Russell looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I knew this day was going to come. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't deny a thing, just stared at the table and started talking. He said Elridge had paid him to look the other way, said there'd been a woman, too blonde, late 40s, worked admin. She had access to files, ID bands, paperwork. She was the one who switched the baby tags, erased the logs, made it all look clean. Russell said he didn't know her name, said he didn't ask. But then he stood up, went to a drawer near the sink and pulled out a box. Inside was an old photo, faded corners, curled, taken at what looked like a staff party. A few people were standing in a line outside the back door of the hospital holding paper plates. Russell pointed to one woman in the photo. That's her, he said. She's the one who told me it was for the greater good. Said the baby was going somewhere better. Michael took the photo. I stepped closer and looked. My stomach turned. I recognized her. Not from the hospital, from now. Michael, I said quietly, that's Diane. He looked at me, then back at the photo. You're sure? I nodded. Ethan showed me a picture of her once. It's her. The ride back to Chicago felt longer than it should have. Neither of us spoke much. The rain came down in sheets, streaking the windshield and blurring the highway lights. I kept the photo in my lap, one thumb pressed into the corner. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. By the time we pulled onto Diane Street, the sky had gone from gray to nearly black. We didn't have a plan. We just knocked. She answered the door like she'd been expecting us. She didn't cry this time, didn't slam anything. She just opened the door wide and stepped back. We followed her into the living room. There was a soft chair by the window and a framed photo of Ethan on the wall behind it, middle school, maybe smiling awkwardly, a bandage on his elbow. Diane sat on the edge of the chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap. I stood across from her. Michael stayed quiet. She looked at me, then down at her hands. "I never thought he'd go looking," she said. Her voice was calm, but her face was pale. I asked, "Why did you lie about the adoption?" She didn't answer right away, just stared at the floor. Then she said, "Because I knew how it would look." Her voice barely carried. "I paid for a child. I was promised. He wasn't. I know that now." She reached up and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I didn't want to lose him. Not after everything." She got up, walked to a small cabinet in the hallway, opened it, and pulled out a leather folder. Inside was a faded yellow baby blanket, ducks printed in a line across the middle. I didn't need to touch it to know it was his. I remembered packing it that night, folding it carefully into the hospital bag next to the onesie and the hat. Diane handed it to me. "He's yours," she said. I always knew that deep down. Michael stayed behind to speak with her more. I stepped outside and sat on the front steps with the blanket in my hands. The street was quiet. One porch light flickered across the road. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat still, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. There was no peace in what she'd said, no justice in any of it. But I finally had something real in my hands, something I had packed for him with hope 19 years ago and never expected to see again. Michael came out a few minutes later. He said the lab that had done the DNA test admitted there'd been a note sent with the sample and anonymous request to expedite the results with special attention to the maternal match. No name, just a routing address, a proxy server based in Oregon. Michael said it quietly, almost like he didn't want to say it at all. It was him, he said. Elridge. He tampered with it. Faked the whole thing. I nodded. I didn't feel shock. Not anymore. I just felt tired. But it wasn't over. Not even close. We had a name, a location, and now we had more than suspicion. We had proof someone had gone to great lengths to keep the truth buried. And someone like that doesn't stop just because time has passed. The snow had started falling again by the time we got back to the motel. It wasn't heavy, just the soft kind that drifted down without sound, the kind that didn't ask for attention. Michael spread the documents out on the table, but I didn't sit. I stood near the heater, arms crossed, watching the air blow through the vent like it might carry some kind of answer with it. We had the baby blanket. We had Diane's admission. We had Russell's statement and the photo. And now we had confirmation that the DNA test had been manipulated, redirected through a proxy server in Oregon, tied to a defunct consulting firm. But that wasn't enough. Not for Ethan. Not yet. He needed more than memory. He needed certainty. So did I. That night we looked for labs. Somewhere neutral, somewhere with no history connecting to either side. Michael called a place in Evanston. Small, independent, reputable. I filled out the paperwork in the back seat of the car while Michael drove. It was quiet except for the defrost rattling. My hands were stiff. The pen barely moved the way I wanted it to. At the lab, the woman behind the desk was polite professional. She never asked questions. We each submitted samples, cheek swabs, sealed bags, signatures. They told us the results would take 4 business days. We went back to the motel and waited. Waiting like that makes time feel wrong. Too slow and too fast at the same time. I spent hours pacing the room, rereading old notebooks, repacking the envelope from Linda. Some nights I couldn't sleep at all. I'd watch the headlights cross the ceiling when a car passed, wondering what Ethan was doing, whether he believed me, whether he wanted to. The fifth morning, Michael went to the lab alone. I couldn't bring myself to go. I stayed behind and sat at the small kitchen table with the folded yellow blanket across my lap. When he came back, he didn't speak. He just handed me the envelope. I opened it. Inside 2 pages. I read the first line and stopped. No biological relationship detected. I read it again, then again. The words didn't change. My body felt like it didn't fit around itself. I passed the paper back to Michael. He looked it over slower than I had. His face didn't change, but his shoulders dropped. "I don't understand," I said. My voice was too thin, like it didn't have weight. "It has to be him." Michael flipped to the second page, scanned the markers. "The comparison isn't even close," he said. "Different chromosomes, different maternal lines. Amanda, this isn't a match." I couldn't hear him after that. I got up, walked into the bathroom, sat down in the empty tub, and held the photo of Noah against my chest. I stayed there until the water from the faucet started dripping cold down the side of the wall. That night, Michael sat outside the bathroom door. He didn't knock. He didn't say much. Just stayed close. When I finally opened the door, I asked him if he still believed me. He nodded. "Then how do you explain this?" I asked. He didn't answer. The next morning, the motel phone rang. Michael picked up. It was Linda. She said she'd remembered something. There had been a janitor one who always worked overnights. A man named Russell had mentioned him once before, but she hadn't thought anything of it until now. His name was Alan Graves. He was her cousin, technically. She hadn't seen him in years, but she remembered something odd he'd once told her, that the hospital kept things locked that no one ever checked. A records closet off the east hallway. Said he'd seen Elridge in there more than once. Michael took notes. After he hung up, he pulled up the hospital blueprints, the ones we'd gotten from a records request months earlier. Sure enough, there was an unmarked storage room listed off the staff hallway. Paper files only, no camera coverage. The hospital had changed ownership twice since 2006. We called. The new administrator requested access to historical storage. Michael used his badge, his contacts. They gave us a 2-hour window, no extensions. The building smelled different now, cleaner, updated. New signs, new paint. But the bones of it were the same. I could feel it in the hallway and the way my steps echoed on the tile. We reached the east corridor. The door to the records closet was stiff, but it opened. Dust floated in the beam of Michael's flashlight. Boxes everywhere. Floor to ceiling, stacked without order. No digital index, no staff to help. We started going through them one by one. I found logbooks, shift reports, patient charts from years no one had touched. It took over an hour, but eventually I opened a box labeled 2006, March, birth and discharge logs. The folders were crammed in sideways. Many were torn or faded. But near the back, paper-clipped to a pink carbon form, was a handwritten note. It listed infant M. Collins, discharged, maternal abandonment assumed. There was no signature, no medical notes, just an initial CE. Michael held it under the flashlight and exhaled slowly. "They filed you as if you walked away," he said. I nodded. I couldn't feel my hands. Back at the motel, we scanned the form, emailed a copy to the lab in Evanston, and asked them to review the chain of custody again. The technician on the other end paused when Michael mentioned the expedited request. He said there had been an anomaly, a second request attached to the submission unsigned routed through an Oregon IP. Michael asked for the metadata. The tech hesitated, then agreed to send it. When it arrived, the request file had been masked through a proxy. The sender listed no name but the routing logs tied back to a VPN used by a now-defunct medical consultancy once registered to a man named Edward Marsh. It was an alias. Michael pulled it up on his laptop. Edward Marsh was an alternate identity used by Dr. Charles Elridge. My stomach turned. The DNA test had been tampered with, swapped, likely rerun with a false sample. It was never about disproving the connection, Michael said quietly. It was about delaying it. I sat down on the edge of the bed. He knew where we'd go before we did. We didn't sleep that night. Michael worked on tracing the Oregon firm's business filings. I sorted through every photo I had, hospital photos, Ethan's bus past the blanket. All of it. Somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, Michael found a lead. A cabin listed under the consulting firm's holdings located in a wooded area outside Salem. No road access. But satellite images showed a structure still standing, chimney intact. Michael picked up the phone. He called in a favor from a private investigator out of Eugene. We'd know more by the afternoon. I sat near the window and watched the sun start to break through the clouds. For the first time in years, it didn't feel warm, but it was something. A direction, a shadow that finally had shape. And now that we could see it, we could follow. The private investigator called late the next afternoon. His voice was low, even like he knew not to rush anything. Said the cabin was real. Said there'd been a man living there who fit Elridge's description, but under the name Edward Marsh. No utilities registered, no formal address. Just a string of supply runs, paid in cash, a burner phone, and a post office box listed to the shell company we'd already traced. The property sat northwest of Salem, tucked past an old gravel road that barely showed up on satellite maps. The investigator had taken photos from a distance. A-frame structure, aging roofline windows, boarded from the inside. But what caught my attention was the chimney. There was smoke coming from it, still warm. That meant someone was there. Michael and I packed up and left at sunrise the next day. The drive was long, silent, in stretches like we were already bracing ourselves for what we might find. I stared out the window at the edge of passing towns, gas stations, weather-beaten farms. The farther we got from the city, the more the trees closed in. By late afternoon, we turned onto the gravel road. It was narrow and soft from rain, the tires kicking up small sprays of mud as we climbed. We parked a few hundred feet back and walked the rest of the way on foot. The woods were still. Damp needles underfoot, a kind of muffled hush hanging in the air. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the wind. The cabin came into view, slowly set low in a dip between two sloping hills shrouded in fir and alder. It didn't look abandoned. There were no signs of damage, no graffiti, no animals nesting in the eaves, just the quiet presence of something being kept deliberately hidden. Smoke still drifted from the chimney, thin but steady. Michael knocked first. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time, and we waited. Then the door creaked open a few inches. A man stepped into the gap. Thinner than I remembered from the old hospital photo hair, now white glasses resting low on his nose. But it was him, Elridge. He didn't look surprised. Just studied us the way you'd study something you'd already calculated. "You found me," he said, like it was a statement, not a concern. I stepped forward before Michael could speak. "You took my son," I said. He tilted his head slightly as if inspecting a specimen. "I placed him," he replied. Michael pushed past him, badge already out. "You altered medical records, falsified discharge logs, tampered with evidence in an active investigation. You sabotaged a DNA test." Elridge didn't move. "I protected a system," he said flatly, "one that failed too often. I gave order where there was chaos." I stepped inside. The air was stale paper wood smoke and something metallic underneath. The cabin was sparse. One cot, one table. No family photos, no books, no clutter. Just boxes. Dozens of them stacked and labeled in shorthand codes, year's initials. Elridge turned toward a shelf, reached behind a radio, and pulled out a small flash drive. Held it out toward us. "You'll want this," he said. Michael took it without a word. Back in the car, neither of us spoke for the first 10 miles. It wasn't until we reached the edge of a small town and found a cafe with working Wi-Fi that we opened the laptop. Michael plugged in the drive and clicked the first folder. Thousands of files, scanned documents, hospital rosters, internal memos, payment logs. Everything sorted by date and state. We scrolled through March 2006. There it was. Noah Collins. A folder marked with his name. Inside 2 audio recordings, 1 intake form, and 1 internal note flagged confidential. I opened the first audio file. The speaker was a woman young, nervous, her voice low. "So, the mother's name is Amanda Collins," she said. "She's 23. No insurance. No listed partner." There was a pause. Then a second voice answered. "Elridge's." "Good. Prep the paperwork. The buyer's ready." Michael reached over and clicked pause. The room was quiet. We sat like that for a long time. I stared at the screen, the folder still open, my name sitting there in black and white. I whispered, "They planned it before I even gave birth." Michael nodded slowly. "They targeted you." I leaned back in the chair. My arms felt weightless. We clicked through a few more folders. Other names. Other infants. Some we recognized from archived cold case reports, others we didn't. But the pattern was there. Young mothers, isolated, limited support, all flagged as priority clearance. Then we played the second recording. I wasn't ready for what I heard. A baby crying, a lull between sobs, then my own voice, shaky quiet, singing, "You are my sunshine." I pressed pause again and turned away. Michael didn't say anything. He backed up the files twice and stored copies on encrypted drives. "We'll bring this to the feds," he said. I nodded, still facing the window. But first, I wanted Ethan to hear it. All of it. 3 days later, we met in a rented apartment just off a quiet street near his campus. Ethan answered the door with his hair still damp from a shower. He looked older, like the last few weeks had taken something from him. We sat at the table. I slid the flash drive across the wood and waited. He plugged it in and listened to the recordings without asking a single question. His hands didn't shake, but his jaw clenched. When the second recording ended, he leaned back in the chair and covered his face with both palms. "They lied to me," he said. "They lied to both of us." I didn't interrupt. After a long silence, he asked, "Why me?" I didn't answer right away. "Because I was alone," I said. "Because I didn't have anyone to fight for me. Because they thought no one would notice." He nodded slowly. Then he asked the question I never thought I'd hear. "Do you still want me?" I reached across the table. I never stopped. He didn't pull away. That night, Michael filed the first report with a federal contact he trusted, an agent who specialized in long-term medical fraud and trafficking cases. We didn't know how far this would go or how many names it would uncover. But we knew it had begun. Ethan stayed with us for dinner. We didn't talk much after that. Just sat with plates on our laps, the volume on the TV turned down low, the flash drive still sitting on the table between us. He didn't ask to keep it. But when he left, he took the files. The next morning, we got a call. Not from an agent. Not from Diane. From someone else. A name I didn't recognize, tied to a story I thought I'd never hear again. And just like that, another door creaked open. Federal agents arrived in Salem 2 days later. Michael and I met them outside the cabin just after sunrise. There was no dramatic standoff, no shouting, just a quiet knock on the door and the sound of boots on rotting porch steps. Elridge let them in without a word. I stayed back near the car, my breath making small clouds in the morning chill, watching as the agents filed out carrying boxes, hard drives, ledgers, stacks of labeled folders. Elridge didn't fight. He watched the scene with the same blank calculation he'd shown us, like he'd already moved on to a future none of us could see. The agents took him into custody and promised to keep us updated. We handed over the flash drive, every copy, every backup, and then it was just Michael and me in the quiet watching the road disappear under tire tracks and mud. That night, we drove straight back to Chicago. I called Ethan as soon as we crossed the city limits. He answered after the first ring. I could hear traffic in the background and the tired weight in his voice. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I want to see you." We met at a coffee shop the next morning. It was nearly empty, the kind of place that played old country music low and left the windows open even when it was cold. Ethan looked older than he had just a week before. There was a set to his shoulders I hadn't noticed, and the dark mark under his left eye seemed deeper in the window light. He pulled out the flash drive, set it on the table between us. I listened to everything he said. He didn't sound angry, just tired, careful. I nodded. "I know it doesn't change what happened," I said, "but it's proof." He nodded, eyes down. "They told me my mother died," he said quietly, "that I was lucky. I guess I was lucky in a way. I could have ended up anywhere." He paused, then looked up at me. "Do you ever wish you'd just let it go?" The question sat between us, weighty, unfinished. I tried to answer honestly. For a long time I thought if I let go, the pain would let go of me. But it never did. He nodded. "I think I always knew something was wrong. Not with you, just with the story." He slid the flash drive back to me. "What happens now?" "The case is open. The agent said Elridge will face charges. Diane could be questioned. There are other names, other files." Ethan tapped his finger on the table. "I saw one. A girl, Marissa Jensen. Portland, 2007. I wrote down the name. We'll pass it along." He looked at me, then away. "I want to come to Portland," he said, "not to move in. Just to see." I smiled but kept it quiet. "Whenever you're ready." The following week, news started moving faster than I could follow. Federal agents raided 2 other properties tied to the consulting firm in Oregon. More files were found, records for at least 7 more children, each one with a similar pattern. Mothers isolated paperwork, falsified babies placed off the books. It made the news, but only as a small story buried on the 3rd page of the local paper. Michael told me that was normal given the scope and the number of open questions. They needed to work in the dark for a while, he said, to make sure everyone named in the files could be tracked and accounted for. I tried to focus on what I could do. I went back to Portland, reopened the diner, and waited. Every Friday, Michael called with updates. He kept his voice low, never raised his hopes too high. Sometimes he would read from the agent's report. Sometimes he would just say, "There's nothing new, not yet." A month after the arrest, Ethan called me from his apartment. He said he wanted to visit, so I picked him up at the train station the next afternoon. He didn't bring much, a small duffel, a stack of old textbooks, a faded sweatshirt. He stayed in a spare room above the diner, kept mostly to himself. I let him take the lead. Some mornings he would come down early, make coffee for both of us before opening, and we would sit quietly watching the sun creep over the water. Some days he would leave before I woke, exploring the city on foot, coming back with a notebook full of sketches or half-finished crossword puzzles he'd picked up from Dee, who still came by the diner with her Yorkie. At first, our conversations stayed surface level. Weather food, the kinds of things you say when you're not sure if you're allowed to say more. Then one Sunday he sat across from me and asked, "Do you remember what you sang to me in the hospital I did?" I said so. He closed his eyes, and in a whisper he sang the first line of "You Are My Sunshine." I didn't cry, but the ache was there. Quiet, steady, a memory pressing up from somewhere I couldn't name. Michael came by more often during those weeks, sometimes with news from the investigation, sometimes just to check in. He told me that Elridge had started talking, giving names and places details only someone on the inside would know. More children were identified. Some had already found families, some were still searching. Diane was interviewed by agents. She told the truth. She'd paid in cash, trusted the man who promised her a baby, looked the other way when the paperwork never showed up. She wasn't charged, but she wasn't free of guilt either. She sent Ethan a letter through the agents, a long apology handwritten full of things I don't think I'll ever read. Spring came slow that year. The bay stayed cold longer than usual, and the trees along the street outside the diner didn't green until almost May. One afternoon I stood at the window and watched Ethan walk across the street, head down, hands in his pockets, sunlight tracing the edge of his jaw. I thought about everything we'd lost, but also everything we'd found a story unwinding a family built out of memory and hope and small acts of forgiveness. The door to the diner opened and Michael stepped in. He ordered his usual, sat at the counter, and read the morning news. He didn't ask for details, didn't push for more. He just sat with me in the quiet, the way old friends do when there's nothing left to say, except I'm here. That night, as I closed up, I found a letter slipped under the door. No return address, just my name on the envelope. Inside was a single line, written in neat, careful handwriting. My daughter vanished in 2009. They told me she was gone, but I've never believed it. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, feeling the presence of so many others like me waiting in the dark for a name, a face, a story to come home. I turned off the lights, locked the doors, and climbed the stairs to my apartment, the quiet of the diner following me all the way up. I set the letter down on the counter and stood for a while, letting the words settle in, thinking of all the other parents who would never see their children come home. The case had spread wider than any of us expected. Federal authorities now had files on at least 7 more children, some already adults, all of them taken under similar circumstances, births marked as abandoned paperwork, doctored mothers left without answers. Elridge was facing charges in federal court. They found more evidence inside the cabin, handwritten ledgers, dates, medical codes, even a stack of blank discharge forms signed only with his initials. Michael told me the agents had started interviewing other hospital staff from those years, piecing together how the scheme had worked and how many people had looked away. Some who'd been involved claimed they never understood what they were part of, that the money was just a bonus or a one-time favor. Others kept quiet. I didn't go to the hearings. I stayed in Portland, kept the diner running, tried to give Ethan a sense of ordinary days. He started picking up extra shifts on weekends, learning the rhythms of the place. How Roy liked his oatmeal, how Dee folded her crosswords and left them for me. Sometimes after closing, we'd walk down to the water and just sit, letting the salt air clear the heaviness out of our lungs. There were nights when Ethan would ask about the early years, what he was like as a baby, if I remembered the first time he smiled, how I picked his name. Sometimes I had answers, sometimes only stories I'd told myself to keep from forgetting. He'd listen, eyes steady, hands folded, letting each small truth fill the space between us. The federal case moved slowly, but justice came in pieces. The news ran a short segment when Elridge finally agreed to a plea deal. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, no chance of parole. Diane was never charged, but she left the city and sent Ethan one last letter, a real one this time, in her own handwriting with no address or phone number. Only the words, "I'm sorry," written 3 times before she signed her name. Ethan read it alone, then tucked it away in a drawer upstairs. Michael came by the diner every Friday sometimes with news, sometimes just to sit and drink coffee. He told me 2 other mothers had reached out after reading about the case online. One in Oklahoma, one in Ohio. Both missing children, both still hoping. I started writing them back. It felt right one small way to make sure their stories didn't slip between the cracks. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about bearing witness, about letting people know someone would remember. Ethan moved out that summer. He didn't go far, just a room above the bookstore downtown. He still came by for Sunday breakfast, always bringing the crossword section or a faded photograph he'd found among Diane's things. The first time he smiled, really smiled was the day he handed me a tiny cassette tape, barely labeled. "Found this in an old box," he said. "I think it's from the hospital." That night, I sat in my living room and played it. Static then, a baby's thin cry, then my own voice humming, "You are my sunshine." I closed my eyes and let myself remember not just the loss, but the beginnings, the hope, the feeling of being someone's mother, even if only for a short time. I didn't cry. I just sat with it, letting the ache be what it was. The investigation kept growing. The agents found connections to hospitals in 3 other states, all with the same patterns: children marked as abandoned, then quietly placed, money changing hands off the books. Michael told me it would take years to find all the families. Some files were lost or destroyed. Some children might never be found. But enough came forward that it felt like something was breaking open a silence, giving way to truth. The diner became a place for quiet reunions. Some mothers came through looking for someone to talk to. Sometimes they wanted advice. Sometimes they just wanted someone to sit with them for a cup of coffee and a few minutes of understanding. Ethan was good with them. He never said much, but he had a way of making people feel less alone. Once a woman from Tulsa brought a photo of her daughter. Ethan sat beside her for an hour, listening, pointing out the small details in the picture that only a parent would notice. When she left, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "You gave me hope." I tried to remember that hope myself, even on the days when the heaviness returned. It wasn't the kind of pain that ever went away fully, but it changed shape. It became something I could live beside, something that let me move forward without letting go of what mattered. Michael told me that Elridge's confession included names of others involved: accountants, nurses, even 2 lawyers who'd handled adoptions without asking questions. Some would be prosecuted, others only named. The justice wasn't perfect. It rarely is. But it was real. That fall, on a cold Sunday morning, Ethan and I walked down to the shore. He stood for a long time with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the bay. I handed him a small yellow onesie I'd saved from the hospital, the one with tiny ducks along the collar. He took it carefully, ran his thumb over the faded fabric, and smiled. "You kept it," he said. I nodded. All this time. We stood there in silence, letting the wind carry off what it could. When we walked back, I felt lighter than I had in years. Late that evening, just before closing, I found a second letter slipped under the diner door. Same careful handwriting, another mother still searching. I folded it carefully and set it next to the first. I realized then that stories like ours never really end. They ripple out, passed from one person to the next, each of us holding a small part of the truth. The past still echoed, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with names, with voices, with the steady hope that somewhere, somehow, someone would finally come home. When I look back on everything now, it doesn't feel like one clean story, more like a tide that came in, quietly swept my life into pieces, then pulled me somewhere new. Ethan still lives close by, though he keeps his own apartment above the bookstore and comes down for coffee most mornings before I open the diner. Some days we sit together in silence, both of us nursing our cups, neither feeling the need to fill the air. Other times he'll bring in an old photo or a letter he's found in a box, and we'll talk through what little we both remember and what we wish we could recover. The pain of those years hasn't vanished, but it's changed. Now it's something softer and ache that reminds me of who I am and who I fought for. Michael visits less often these days, his work with the authorities finally winding down, but he always checks in with a phone call sometimes. Just a few words to let me know he's still there if I need him. And every few weeks another letter arrives from someone hoping for the same kind of ending, someone still searching, and I do my best to answer each one. I've learned that justice isn't always a headline or a courtroom verdict. It's the stubborn refusal to let someone's story be erased. It's the quiet work of remembering even when it would be easier to let go. There are nights when the quiet in my apartment still feels too deep when I think of all the years I lost and all the mothers who never got their children back. But I know now that survival doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying those memories forward, letting them shape the way I move through the world. Some wounds heal around the edges, and some never do, but there's meaning in living through them, in showing up every day to the small life I have left, and making room for the people who found their way back. I see it in Ethan in the way he laughs a little more now, or the way he holds a door open for a stranger. I see it in myself when I answer a letter, or share a coffee with someone who needs to be seen. Justice for me became less about punishment and more about connection, about refusing to give up on hope even after the truth came at such a high cost. If you've listened this far, if any part of this story made you think of someone you've loved or lost, I hope you'll say their name out loud tonight. Share this story with someone you trust. Every story matters. Every name deserves to come home. And sometimes the smallest act of remembering is its own kind of justice.